All right, so this again is part of period three, and the big debate about American revolutionary history was the revolution something that was going to happen? Of course, history is tricky. You can't really counterfactual history is arguing what would have happened had it not. But there is a certain degree of inevitability that you'll hear argued by guys like Thomas Paine, argued by the idea of distance, the idea of ethnic divisions, ethnic differences. But the history books often say that it's not a revolution so much as accelerated evolution, meaning eventually, like Canada or Australia, we were going to become independent. The question was not a matter of how, or not a matter of if, but when and how. So the topic that I really want to hammer home with you today, and this will be about it for today, is the ideals of the American Revolution. So keep in mind, there's going to be lots of information about by actions and acts, British policies, leadership, but at the core of the revolution is a mindset that is shared by at least some of the leadership of the revolutionary society, the revolutionary leaders. So the first of that is this notion of a republic. So a republic is a representative government, and a lot of people forget this, but Britain wasn't really a republic. They had a monarchy, but they did have elements of republicanism. They had a parliament, right? But a republic is an ideal that these readers of the Enlightenment, these philosophers of the Enlightenment, had landed on reading Plato and Aristotle, reading the Greeks, studying history as the sort of heightened society where citizens who were a part of the government that self-governed themselves, and they governed with a set of principles, a set of rules, principles that were not necessarily religious, but secular rules, secular principles. And above all, for these Republican-minded, and again, this is republicanism not as a political party, but as the idea of a government that represents the people themselves, a just people, is that we the people, must subordinate, must not seek our only selfish ambitions, but rather to put together for the good of society. Look what it says. This, by the way, is from one of the great Enlightenment writers, Enlightenment philosophers, Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu. And in his writing, he says, it's love of the law and of our country. Now, Mark Twain famously said, patriotism is loving your nation all the time and your government when it deserves it. All right. And so love of the law itself. So for me, that would be the Constitution of the United States and my nation, our country, right? Such love requires preference of the public to the private interest. It means, like you say, well, it might better me, so to speak, but what's in the best interest of the whole country? And that requires effort. I mean, if George Washington just stayed home and been rich and selfish, then history might have been very different. If Benjamin Franklin just stayed a rich printer, then that would have been a different history. But the idea of putting your public interest above the private interest, asking what you can do for your country, in the end has a value shared by all. Okay, a government is like everything else. To preserve it, we must love it. Everything, therefore, depends on establishing this love. So, in other words, I'm not here to indoctrinate you. I'm not here to manipulate you or brainwash you. But these founders believe that the only way a nation governed by themselves could succeed is if you sacrificed for it. Sacrifice is a word that's not necessarily popular anymore. It's the idea is sort of oh, I shouldn't have to sacrifice for my community or for my country. But that's what when you consider soldiers who risk their lives, not because they're getting the GI Bill, but because they believe it's in the best interest of their nation. That's civic virtue. When a politician serves his country and doesn't get any money and doesn't benefit from it personally, that's civic virtue. In other words, you're not doing it for greed or selfish ambition. You're doing it because it's the thing to do for the long-term benefit of your nation. And we are so far removed from that as so many people. Today, it's what is my government and country doing for me right now? And I don't really care much about anybody else in the future. And that's just not what our country was founded on as a principle, as an ideal, the ideal of what's in the best interest for all the people, not for just a handful or a few of the people. Now, that's, again, not always lived up to by the founders, but they were very much committed to this idea, and they believed that the government of England had become selfish, had become corrupt, it had become willing to violate the very principles on which government was established for. And that is one of the reasons why they're very angry. So there is a philosophical, ideological reason for both their participation in the revolutionary period, but also for their anger and frustration with the British government's lack of this as they perceive it. Now, another idea that went along with this Republican idea of civic virtue is the writings and teachings of a group of members of parliament called the Radical Whigs. And the Radical Whigs were very concerned about the use of monarchical power from the king. Keep in mind, and again, this is where knowing English history is very useful for you in an American history class. England had gone through one of the worst periods in its history in the 1600s. England had suffered dramatically after the death of Queen Elizabeth. King James and King Charles had persecuted Puritans. There was this brutal English Civil War on the scale of our Civil War, just really devastating. And then they were getting into a religious conflict again with King James II and the Glorious Revolution. So lots and lots of turmoil, right? So what the Whigs were concerned about in Parliament, W-H-I-G, Whigs, was that this new family of rulers, the Hanover Kings, this is George the First, Second, and Third. The concern was particularly George the Third, who was a fully Englishman. He lived in England and grown up in England, unlike his predecessors. And he was trying to take authority onto the throne. And the Whigs had been the Whigs had been the opponents of James II, and they had also been highly critical of monarchical power because as members of parliament, they'd struggled so much to reduce that power. Well, that idea of Whiggism or radical Whig philosophy came to America. And so both in England and in America, any minor slight to our rights as Englishmen, was considered a slippery slope argument, an argument that was going to lead to the ultimate erosion of liberty. So these folks were hyper vigilant about any diminution of their rights. They did not want their rights neglected or abused or diminished. So that meant between those two things, like I have to sacrifice my own wealth if necessary for the good of a country. And, I have to be very skeptical about what the monarch laid the foundation for this form of revolution. So what emerges from this debate is an interesting debate about the role of Parliament. So Parliament is going to start asserting its authority after the French and Indian War. They're going to start saying, hey, look, we're in charge and you guys have been getting away with not doing much. We're going to start ramping it up a little bit. And the Whigs were like, were more sympathetic. So if you were a Whig in Parliament, like Edmund Burke, for example, you would look out over the colonies and say, well, they're 3,000 miles away. They should have a lot of local control. Okay. But the loyal members of Parliament to the king argued, oh no, as members of Parliament, we represent all our colonies and all our people. And this becomes known as a theory or premise of virtual representation. So in other words, like as a public school teacher, I represent all students. Well, of course not, or represent all people. It's saying that Nancy Pelosi, who is the Congresswoman and Speaker of the House from San Francisco, is accurately representing what the attitudes of Pennsylvania County, Virginia are like. And that's, of course, ludicrous, So the Whigs believed that the Parliament's authority was limited, okay? And then the second question that arose then was that if the Parliament doesn't have total authority over the colonies, how then can the colonies represent themselves with Britain? And this becomes a major question. So, the British at one point will actually offer to the colonial representatives an opportunity to send members of Parliament, to Parliament. But this is going to be rejected by the colonists. And if you're bright, you'll probably be able to figure out why. The colonists don't really want taxation with representation in England. And the reason is that they're going to be vastly outnumbered in the British Parliament. So you could send, 4 or 8 members of Parliament from America, or 12 or 13 for that matter, and then they'll be voted down every time. And so they don't want that. So what they want is representation here. They want to be able to have a voice, particularly in their own domestic policies. And that's what at the foundation for all of this. Keep in mind, they have a very long tradition dating back to House of Burgesses, Massachusetts General Court, town hall meetings. So the Brits decide that they're going to have to fix their mercantile errors. The biggest problem for the Brits is that they have not been enforcing salutary neglect. And so what the British have seen a rise in, particularly, is effective smuggling. And that means, if you're John Hancock, who was known in America and Britain as the king of smugglers, you're able to make lots and lots of money by avoiding British taxation, or by avoiding British ports, or by avoiding having British customs agents board your ships. So he's a smuggler, like Han Solo himself. All right. And so what happens is in 1761, Parliament authorizes the use of judicial orders. Judges are able to write warrantless search warrants. And what that means is, historically, the right of a search warrant was very much a part of being a British subject. But because smuggling becomes so common, the British Admiralty courts, as they were called, these are courts set up for naval purposes, were able to board ships or enter warehouses on docks without probable cause, without a search warrant. And what this would become known as is a writ of assistance, meaning we're going to enter, and if we think you have something, we're going to search, and then if there's nothing there, you're fine. But if we find something, you're a smuggler and you're going to get arrested. So this was common, and so it led to was a case where this individual, James Otis, was an American merchant, and his warehouse was entered, and he sued, as a good civilized man should, right? And the American colonial argument was the right of property should be higher than the right of Parliament passing a statute, a law. But he lost. All right. In other words, the writ of assistance overrode the traditional right to a search warrant. And there you go. There's a beginning. And keep in mind, this is during the French and Indian War, but this is the beginning of that slippery slope. Like, oh, well, we can just suspend search warrants if we want to, or we don't have to have probable cause, which, are big deals in our system of justice. And so because of this, because the British had sort of never implemented a full mercantile government or system, smuggling had become very common, and now the Brits are trying to find a way to stop it. The problem is they pick the place in America that is the most independent-minded place of all, and that is Boston. Now, when I say independent-minded, I don't mean independent-minded like North Carolina and Rhode Island, but I mean independent from British enforcement. These are the guys that the laws most should affect, but have not been being enforced on. They've been grown up, so to speak, without it. And so what this leads to is where we'll start tomorrow with a host of sort of new ideas on how to get money from the American colonies, which is going to be the daunting challenge for the British government for the next 10 years. All right.